Today in our collect, we prayed the words, we acknowledge that we are wonderfully, that God has wonderfully created us in his own image, and yet more wonderfully restored us. But we went on to pray that as Jesus came to share our humanity, so we may share the life of his divinity. And so that humanity in one hand, divinity in the other hand. We spent a lot of time over Christmas focusing on Jesus, or God's humanity in Jesus. We refer to this time as the incarnation of God into our midst, God coming to be part of human life, to experience human life. And we've spent some time just really worshiping God for that incredible gift that God gives to our world. Bishop Jeff preached yesterday at 8 o'clock and just spoke to us about the amazing nature of creation in which we live, the hugeness of the universe or multiverse that we're part of, and the insignificance of our planet within that, and clearly our insignificance as human beings in the midst of all of that. And yet God chooses to come in Jesus to be part of this planet's life, to be part of humanity's experience. Today's reading from the gospel touches on something of just the human nature of Jesus as a child, as a growing boy, and wonderful sense of just family and confusion that comes with that. The family having been down from Nazareth to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, and of course traveling in a large family group, expecting the children would have just moved between families, uncle and aunt here, a few cousins there. It's not surprising it took them a few days to recognize that Jesus was missing. And when you consider Nazareth's only about 150 kilometers from Jerusalem, they must have virtually been in Nazareth before they realized that he was missing. And eventually they go back to find him in the temple. And when they ask him, why wasn't he with everyone, he shares that this is where he needs to be. This is his father's house. And just on a practical level, at our crib service on Friday evening, we had a couple of families, with four families. And the one family, there was a 14-year-old, there was an 11-year-old, and there was a 4-year-old. And of course, the 14-year-old has reached that point where he is a young teenager, feeling his adultness coming in, and you could see his sense of not wanting to necessarily fully interact with the more child-focused service, although he very kindly took a figurine and helped me put that in the crib. But that was the 14-year-old. Then there was an 11-year-old who, let me go to the 4-year-old first. I want to say that if you ever want to know what's happening in anybody's family life, just ask a 4-year-old. She was really cute, wonderfully wanting to share all sorts of information, relevant, irrelevant, about what we were doing. But the 11-year-old, and this is my point, was actually really, there was a growing level of interest in life. And as I asked questions, he was the one who just happily put his hand up, gave responses. And there's something about 11 going on 12 that one's beginning to interact with life at a deeper level and beginning to ask questions and wanting to understand. And just I was struck with just his interaction at the crib service, how and then today's gospel reading that really defined Jesus in the temple, just showed there's obviously bigger implications to it, but it just showed that 11, 12-year-old desire to really begin to understand what's happening. And Luke gives us this wonderful insight into Jesus really beginning to say, who am I? What is God's call on my life? What is this all about? And meeting with the teachers of the law, meeting with those who understood something of the traditions and the spirituality of Judaism, and Jesus drawing on that as a growing boy. And so just a wonderful picture there, beyond all the other theology we can pull from that, of just this humanity that we see in Jesus' life at that point. But of course, the creed takes us beyond just Jesus becoming human. It speaks about Jesus or God becoming human, God coming into our lives to share our humanity so that we may share the life of his divinity. Now, the question, of course, is what does that mean? What does that look like? What is it all about? And for me this morning, I think the key comes in with our reading from Colossians. Chapter 3 obviously doesn't start at verse 12 where we entered the narrative. It starts back at verse 1. And of course, the book as a whole is important to hold with this. But chapter 3 in the NRSV is headed a new life in Christ. And what Paul is really grappling with in this chapter is, what does it mean to immerse ourselves in the divinity of God? What does it mean to enter into relationship with God? And what does it mean for us in just the practicalities of daily living? And so if we go back to an earlier part in the chapter, back to verse 5 and 8, Paul reflects on kind of the brokenness of what it is to be human. And you and I know how easy it is for human beings for us to just enter into that negative space. And Paul is saying, if we want to experience the divinity of God, we need to take these things and we need to put them behind us. We need to walk away from them. And so he says, put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly. Now, I don't think Paul here is negating our humanity. He's talking about those things that become destructive to human life and relationship. Put to death whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desires, and greed, which is, in brackets says, which is idolatry. And Paul goes on in 3 verses later, verse 8, to say, but now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Paul highlighting all that is clearly not divine about our humanness, and yet often is so interwoven into the way we relate and to the brokenness we experience as human beings. Verse 12, Paul is shifting into saying, now this is what it means to be in relation. This is the practical implication of what it is to be in relationship with God. And in terms of this Sunday and our Christmas journey, this is what sharing in God's divinity is all about. This is what it looks like. And he starts with those incredible words: as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. What does it mean to be chosen? What does it mean to be holy? What does it mean to be loved? To be chosen, it reflects, and if we look back at our Christmas story, if you go back as far as Gabriel's annunciation to Mary about the fact that she will bear the Christ child, he says to her, you are truly favored by God. To be favored is another way of saying you are chosen. And that theme for me has come through our Christmas services, that actually not only was Mary favored, but God favors humanity. And as we seek to enter into relationship with God, into divinity, so we need to acknowledge that we too are favored. And that favor is defined in terms of holiness and being beloved. And again, holy in this context is to be like God. Another definition of being holy is to be different as God is different. And again, getting our minds around what that may mean and look like is maybe more complicated. But to be different as God is different is what Paul is saying here. Put these things that are destructive aside and embrace that which reflects the nature of God. Seek to live that out. Be conscious about putting those negative things aside. Be conscious about embracing what is good. And know that you're beloved. And that really is the nature of the Christmas story, a reminder that God so loved the world that he sent his son, that God became incarnate, that God embraced our experience of life. Paul, having said these things, of course, goes on to say, in order to live out this, your chosen nature, in order to live out your holiness and being beloved, clothe yourselves. And he mentions 5 things. He says, clothe yourself with compassion, with kindness, with humility, with meekness, with patience. Now, again, those are words. And what is not helpful about life is that language changes, or words change meaning over time. And so words, when Paul wrote them, when they were translated into English, meant something. But in fact, in kind of common awareness or common usage, some of these words actually mean something different from what I think Paul purposed them to have. So a word like compassion, so I just need to find another space in my laptop. There we go. A word like compassion could be described, or should be described in the faith space, as compassion is a deep empathy with one another. Now, the difference between, for me, compassion and sympathy, between empathy and sympathy is kind of patting you on the back and saying, I really feel sorry for you. But, please know that I feel sorry, but, carry on with your life. I'm going to carry on with mine. Empathy, which is at the heart of compassion, is actually saying, help me to understand what you're experiencing. Help me understand so that I can walk beside you and be part of this journey with you. Allow me into your shoes. Allow me into your perspective. That's what compassion is about, really seeking out that deep empathy. And again, it reflects the nature of God coming into our world. It's a compassionate act. God wants to come and be part of our reality. And so to clothe ourselves with compassion is to seek to be part of the reality of each other's lives, and to do that meaningfully and deeply. We then move on to kindness. And kindness, I think, is not a difficult word. Kindness means kindness. It means being gentle. It means being caring. It means just not being harsh, dictatorial, etc. It really means reaching out in a very full way to one another. Then we hear the word humility. And humility is one of those words that I think has changed its meaning over time. One of the interesting things which I happened to do was just go and Google a definition for humility. And I'm not sure Google always comes up with particularly good definitions, but it does tell us what is kind of just socially floating out there, what's the kind of common understanding. And the definition that Google came up with is that humility is the quality of having a modest or low view of one's importance. Now hold that against the fact that we are chosen, we are beloved, we are called to be holy. Humility here is suggesting that actually it's to deny that. It's to say, I'm not important, I'm irrelevant. That's the kind of common understanding of humility at this point in our common culture. But I would suggest that in terms of our faith, that a slightly different definition would be useful. And that would be that humility is the quality of listening, respecting, engaging, and honoring one another. Let me read that to you again. Humility is the quality of listening, respecting, engaging, and honoring one another. Another word that we may want to replace that with would be to be graceful. Grace is this nature of humility, one that really does take other people into account and say, I really want to hear, I want to hear from you. I respect who you are as a fellow human being. I respect who you are as someone who similarly to me carries the image of God. And in terms of just remembering Archbishop Desmond Tutu this morning, he was a man who was truly humble on this level, willing to engage, willing to honor the other person. You can see the difference between the kind of common definition and one that speaks to the depth of what Paul is calling us to in the Colossians reading today. And then, of course, another word that comes up, which is meekness. And I don't know what you hear when you hear that word. The similarity that it has to weakness in terms of just the audible nature of it has always made meekness difficult for me, because I hear weakness, although that's not what the word means. But again, if we Google that, one of the definition that comes up is it says that meekness is the fact or condition of being meek. Okay, and that sometimes definitions really don't help in that way. But it goes on to say it is submissiveness. Now again, and I'm not going to take you to a definition of submissiveness. It's used often in Paul's writing. And again, when you link that into meekness with a kind of social, with a kind of understanding of our social environment today, meekness kind of says it's all about just throwing yourself down on the ground and saying to people, please use me as a doormat, wipe your feet on me, walk over me. That's the kind of sense that comes out through this Google definition. But again, I would suggest that Paul, in referring to this, has different purpose in the meaning here. And I would suggest in terms of faith and life and embracing our divinity, meekness is the dialing down of personality in cases where others need space to express themselves. Meekness is the dialing down of personality in cases where others need space to express themselves. Meekness seeks to not trample on others, but to help them up and along. And so, yeah, a wonderful sense of wholeness to that word meekness in that context. It's about recognizing that I am, or you are, we're big people. We can be quite self-referencing a lot of the time. We can be all that we are. And to actually ourselves choose in certain contexts to quieten our own voices, to quieten our own personalities. Why? To allow the voices of others to be raised. And to take that, to allow that space to be one in which it's not just me being heard, but it is really acknowledging one another. If you've ever been involved in leading groups and things, one of the key aspect of being a small group leader is to quieten the noisy ones and to draw out the quieter ones. It is to engender meekness in the group dynamic. We're called to that as part of our divinity. And then the last word that Paul uses here is patience. And patience, of course, as you and I know and often struggle with, and as part of being part of our Advent journey, is all about waiting. And often it is waiting for others. And that can be so difficult. It's one of the things I hugely struggle with. I can sit in a meeting, I can sit in whatever, and I can very often see this is the way forward. We should just be doing this. And the temptation I have is before others have been given a voice or had an opportunity to voice their perspective, their understanding, their outlook, I want to step in. I'm impatient. The joy I'm discovering as I grow a little older and hopefully a little bit more mature and hopefully a little bit more aware is that when I quieten my voice, when I create that space for others to speak, as I take time to listen, as I am patient, so the conversation, the journey together draws out so much more than what I think. At the end of the day, I'm probably quite convinced that I'm right. And that if I'd said this, we could have just shortened a meeting by a whole couple of hours. But actually, I may be right, but that conversation has expanded my perspective dramatically. And it has also meant, because others have been given voice through my patience, that there is a common commitment to moving forward. It's not just, hopefully, Mark's idea. It is something that is our idea. And so these 5 or 6 words are I think, really quite significant. Paul saying this is part of what it is to be or to represent or to share the divinity of God in our world. And you and I, as people of faith, are called to that. And so on the Sunday after Easter, as we begin, after Christmas, as we begin to look forward to the new year and all that 2022 will hold, I really encourage us to find ways to really reflect on what it is to be chosen, to be favored by God, to be beloved, to be loved deeply by God, and to seek the holiness of God to be reflected in and through us. And I would encourage you going forward, let's take time to reflect on what compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience actually looks like in our lives, to be conscious and awake to living this and to making a difference in the world in which we live. Amen.